what I want to do this afternoon is really pick up from Joy's session this morning and the discussion we were having just before lunch. And I've slightly changed the title of it from what's on the programme. I thought, was it Tensions and Dilemmas with Six on the Day? It's the kind of thing you put in when you're not quite sure what you talk about. What I thought might be worth focusing on is what is the practice of practice-based education. And I actually take quite a different view from Joy in that I think it's absolutely necessary for things not to be practice-based education for us to improve practice-based education. We need to know what it isn't rather than try to include everything within this wonderfully wide church. So the interesting question is, what do we throw out? But the even more interesting question is not what we throw out, but what is it that we really cherish? What is it that's absolutely at the core of what we do? And that's one of the things I want to explore. So these kind of things I want to focus on. Revisit again what practice-based education is. What is the practice? Pose this question: what constitutes good practice-based education? We cannot develop this area unless we have a notion of what good is. Is good more practice? Not necessarily. So what is good? What are the things that it necessarily has to be about? You know? What are the things that we need to hang on to right to the end, till they're just trying to prise our fingers off it? What is it that? And I think a lot of the things that we include in our bucket of practice-based education might not be necessarily need to be there. So if we're going to conceptualise what practice-based education is, what ideas we want to draw upon, I'm going to draw on some familiar ones, but I want to sort of take a slightly interesting take on those. I want to just very briefly mention something about how do we design programs on the basis of this, because that says what do we really focus on in what we design, and what isn't in the foreground. I want to touch on some of these other things as well, if there's time. So is it just another way of referring to all these things? If we've got a course and it's got some of this stuff in somewhere, we just stamp it practice-based education, that's it. Well, I think that is very unsatisfactory. I think that is kind of conceptually loose. And I don't think being conceptually loose is a thing that we need to be very proud of. So the question is, what is the practice in practice-based education? And it's obviously a very key defining term. It's absolutely central. Like education, all sorts of things are education, but this is practice-based. So is practice more than doing? So most courses now involve students doing some kind of realistic activities now. Even things we don't even label practice-based education do some of this stuff. Is it engagement in a real workplace? Is that a defining characteristic? In which case, do simulations count or don't they count? If you have simulations, well, we're not doing it for real or not. And is it engaging in the specific practices of the given profession? And if it is that, what are these specific practices? How do we characterise them? And I'm not sure that we've got a very good way of doing that so far. So this is the problem. What constitutes good? So I think we should be a bit normative about this. It's all very well to say, let everything hang out, we can all hang it here together. But I think we need to take a view of what good is. So, having a base only in professional practice and having opportunities for practicing are pretty minimal requirements. I don't think that is enough to characterise things as practice-based education. So we do need to engage in what is enough practice, what is appropriate practice, and indeed what is needed in addition to practice. So is it this bit of placement that is the key thing? Or is it something to do with what we do with our students when they're not out there? Yeah? Is it just an academic programme with added placement? I think not. So last year I started to open up this territory in this very room, and these are some of the directions that I concluded with. We need clearer conception of what practice-based education might necessarily involve, and we need that to judge whether we are doing it or not. How do we know what we're doing is appropriate? How do we know what is good? unless we've got some yards. We need a lot more research and analysis of practice in many settings, because we're taking practice as a completely unproblematic concept. And I think we need to problematise it and put it to the centre of our attention. We need to conceptualise the different elements of practice-based education, how they fit together, so we can develop pedagogy. It's not a matter of how, well, there's all these wonderful pedagogies there. I think we need to have a view about that. And we need to critically analyse practice-based courses, course claims and what they encompass. People are claiming all sorts of things, but we really don't have much of a research base to kind of see whether some of these claims are justified. So what concepts might be useful to draw upon? These are just two, and there might be other things we want to pull in the pot, so you might want to suggest some of those. There's a whole body of work on workplace learning and situated learning. And for me, as a researcher in workplaces that do not involve students, with normal workers, whatever they are, workplace learning is not a pedagogy. It is not a pedagogy. It is a site of learning. And there's a whole lot of research being done on workplace learning that just regards that as learning that occurs in workplaces. And some of that's linked in with situated learning and things of that kind. So that's one box I want to draw upon. And the second box I want to draw upon is practice theory. Practice theory is going through a very, very interesting, exciting period of development at the moment. And I think there's all sorts of interesting things we can draw upon there. But even in themselves, these incorporate many ideas. So what might be some of the things we take? From the workplace situated learning area, we might take ideas such as learning occurs in work settings through progressive participation in real tasks with others. Learning is an intrinsic part of working. So if we place people in work situations they will necessarily learn, they won't necessarily learn what we would like them to learn. Right? But they will learn. And of course not all work is generative of learning or characteristic of the particular work of the profession or occupation. So that's another interesting challenge. So that's one thing we can take from this body. And what are the implications of this? Engagement in work is a necessary part of a practice-based curriculum. Well, we assume that anyway. But we need careful selection of kinds of work. So what constitutes the kind of work that we want our students to do on placement, and what characterises the kind of work we don't want to do on placement? Because it's very important they do the kind of work that's actually going to be generative of what these programs are about. And engagement in appropriate work in suitable context should necessarily lead to learning. So this actually starts to focus our attention on judging work. And that's something we haven't really taken up very strongly. We basically assume, well, we'll take it wherever it comes. And I'm not sure that's a good enough reason going into the future. Okay, so if we're going to take practice theory as a bit of an idea that we want to pick up on, from there we can take the idea that learning occurs through participation in practices. And practices are things that have some existence beyond the individual practitioners. They're bundles of bundles of sayings and doings that have existence beyond the particular individuals engaged in them, and they connect material conditions with people and with work. We can elaborate a lot on this, but we don't have time for that. So, some of the features of practice: it involves embodiment, material mediation, relationality, situatedness, emergence and co-construction. We could talk a lot about that, but I'm not going to. So engagement with practice is a central concept. And I think we need to start to unpack this notion of practice. We need to do some conceptual work on practice. And I think practice theory has got some useful things to tell us. At the moment, we have designed programs through an educator's lens. And the educator's lens has program learning outcomes, course learning outcomes, particular tasks, and it's all, in a sense, nested in this nice way, as if we can spell out all the individual learning outcomes and collectively constitute an adequate education if only you could meet them. Now that's very much an educator's view. It's a very reductionistic view. And it's a view that only has a place for individuals and individual outcomes. And our present notion is very acquisition-oriented rather than participation-oriented. We're acquiring things, we don't learn through being in places. And is it possible, and I want to suggest that hopefully it might be, is it possible to integrate such different perspectives within curriculum? And for me, curriculum is the bigger box and pedagogy is a smaller box within curriculum. So let's think about cutting the cake in a very different way. So let's think about the macro, the meso and the micro. So we still will always need program course level outcomes and practices associated with that. And students will always need study practices in which they learn things at the individual level, hopefully with other people. But I think one of the things that we need to think about is there some intermediate, some meso level framing that we actually need to introduce into our curriculum thinking. And I think we need to actually take up the notion of practice. And practice is something where people do things with others and things. And they may have clients and all sorts of other things depending on what the nature of the profession is. But the characteristic of practice is that it is something that professionals do with other people, or an occupation does with other people. And I think we need to do something to unpack this. What is that about? We need to do some conceptual work on that, because if we don't do conceptual work on that, how do we know what is a legitimate practice, what is an appropriate practice for our students to engage in? And maybe a practice-based education consists of students engaging in practice in a number of particular situations. But what might they be? What must they necessarily be? What might they possibly be? So, an implication from this way of thinking is that we need to identify and utilise appropriate practices as a prerequisite for a practice-based curriculum. And it's the identifying them, I think, where we need to do some interesting work. I mean, at the moment we just take them, well, they go with what people do. But I don't think that's quite good enough. The other thing about practices is they cannot be controlled by educators. Necessarily they can't be controlled. Practices, real practices, do what they do. They have a function in the world. They enable certain things to happen. And there is no place for an educator who's outside that to change it. They are there. So we have to accept this lack of control. And then that changes the way in which we think. I think we have to think about curriculum. Because there are bits of it we can't control, there's bits of it that we're not there for, bits of it that we can't fully observe. But there is someone who is there and that provides continuity, and that's the learner. And we need to have to think about different relationships. And the learner is the only part of continuity there, not us. And how does that make us think differently about curriculum? So the choosing of particular environments in this conception is crucial. And it's a challenge for us because often we don't think we have that much choice. So, this is only a very rough sketch of a way of thinking about this. So what would the design of effective practice-based education programs look like? So I think it would look like something like identify and select the professional practices needed to meet the standards of given qualification. What are the things that students must necessarily be involved in? Provide opportunities for full and partial and full participation in practice as a necessary part of the curriculum. So which are the practices that are accessible to students must they necessarily have had full participation in? Which of those is it okay for them to have had partial participation in? And what of those can we be relaxed about? You know, maybe some of this or some of that. Not too important. We need to find a way, this is the interesting challenge, find a way of quality assuring the environment of practice as meeting these requirements for all students. And this is where it gets practically very, very challenging. But then we need to go back to the rest of the programme, and the rest of the programme needs somehow to scaffold students into professional practices through learning events, simulations, etc., prior to and following placement. So we cannot assume that the rest of the programme is untouched. We need to think about what are the other elements of a practice-based curriculum other than the placement bit. Because these two things have got to work together. And are they just scaffolding students into practice? Or are they doing other things as well? And then it comes back to that interesting example from psychology this morning in which they're trying to do multiple things with one curriculum. And it gets them into a bit of an identity bind. And we need to, use other activities to ensure practice has been fully engaged. So we can't necessarily leave the practice setting to fully engage the students with the practice they find there. We might need to do other things as well. So if we're talking about scaffolding students into practice, this is the other bit of the curriculum. These are some of the things we might want to look at. Practice-like activities. Maybe we would expect to see an awful lot more of these than we do in conventional courses. A lot more group work, a lot more cooperative assignments, a lot more students giving and receiving feedback, a lot more debriefing. We might also see a lot more self-managed activities, because if students are the only continuity through practice from the institutional perspective, then how do we equip them? What are the things that they need for this? And these are maybe some of the things they need for it. And then, do they need practice on some elements of practice in a protected environment? And that's what simulation is about. It's about us constructing a safe environment for students to do certain things that we don't want them to do on real people or real machines or whatever. And this brings us to this interesting challenge. And I think it's an idea that I've taken from Peter Knight. And he suggested that nowadays we have so many requirements, so many outcomes that we want students to achieve, there is no way we can actually assess them all. By definition, there is no way we can assess all the learning outcomes. So what do? Do we sample them? We do kind of, what's our trick? And he suggested taking a completely radical approach to this and say, well, we don't assess the students, we assess the environment. And we say, if you engage in this environment, you necessarily would have got these learning outcomes. Necessarily. You can't escape from this environment without meeting these outcomes. So therefore, we don't need to test you on these outcomes. But then, that places an interesting burden on our assessment of environments. And we need to confront questions like this. I'm not going to go through in detail. So all this leads to a very, very rough sketch of a potentially different way of looking at practice-based education, in which we don't accept everything as being there. We take a very hard-line view about the things that must necessarily be there. And if these things must necessarily be there, there may be other things that won't necessarily be there. And we can derive the notion of a practice-based curriculum from something other than, well, it's a collection of all the stuff we do. I'd like some conceptual basis on which to make a decision about whether this is a good or not so good program. But it also leads us to research. And this is not research in a big sense, but it's research that we must do in order to create any given practice-based program. And we need to identify these practices of typical practice environments. We need to identify the practices of common professional work. Seriously identify them, not just kind of make a few rough assumptions. Identify what practices are available for students to engage in and what ways they are available, what kinds of support they might need to do that. So, it leads us to what is missing in PBE, and I think at the moment we do not have a practice of practice-based education. The practice of practice-based education is missing. It's just not there. We don't have a shared conception of practice and how it might be represented, and therefore there is a hole at the heart of our endeavour. And also, and this is a problem across the whole of higher education, is we don't have a good way of thinking about curriculum. We don't have a common view of curriculum that might lead us to seeing what education through practice might look like. And this is a struggle, and it's a struggle beyond the practice-based education area. So thank you.